Thank you very much. I'm, I'm very touched and very grateful for the very kind words and for just the amazing opportunity. This is a real dream come true for me. I would have come to UCSB as an assistant professor some time ago. So to come as the inaugural Mark and Susan Bertelsen Presidential Chair in Technology and Society, it's a big win, and it's really a overwhelming honor. Thank you very much. Chancellor Yang, deans, thank you.
Sorry.
Support staff, professors, colleagues, students, and friends, and my wife Sandra, thank you all very much for coming today, and thank you very, very much for this honor. It's a big honor and it's a big challenge. Someone said that other CITS directors have left me very big shoes to fill, and I agree that that's true. But they're there with shoehorns, trying to make it fit as well as possible, and they're with arches, making sure I have all the support I need every step of the way. The colleagues that I've met, the job I have is amazing. I need to meet scholars all over campus, and I get to go do that. I've never met so many people so impassioned by their interests, so eager to go to work, and so fascinating in the revelations that they share. And I have to say a special thanks to my wife Sandra, who's gone so many places in the world with me, who always makes me laugh, not the least of which was her very poor impersonation of Stevie Wonder just this morning. I'd like to talk to you about love and death and social circuitry, things that happen when we look at how people relate to each other on the internet. And I've got to come clean. Very nice things have been said about me. But I'm a pretty simple interpersonal relationships researcher. And I want to tell you what I've learned from looking at online behavior from that perspective, and to see what implications we might draw out of it for the larger picture about technology and society. So you'll have to work through a couple of studies with me to see what conclusions we can get to. But I do believe that the internet and social technologies take advantage of our social circuitry. They take advantage of our vulnerabilities and desires. They meet that incredibly well, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill. My own background, this is a picture of my undergraduate days. My own background, as I mentioned, was in studying nonverbal and interpersonal communication. And in the mid-'80s, Professor Gabriel Solomon gave me a couple of articles to read. He said, this is about computer-mediated communication. People type messages to each other. This is what happens to relationships when there are no nonverbal cues. And these were very influential papers that he asked me to read at the time in the field of psychology, and in the field of management, and in the field of technology, and in the field of communication. And I'm so glad Professor Ron Rice is here, because he was a very influential voice in this field as well. It was his review article in 1987, which summarized the field, I think, best well. What happens when there's no nonverbal cues? CMC, or computer-mediated communication, because of the lack of audio or video cues, will be perceived as impersonal and lacking in normative reinforcement. So there will be less socio-emotional content exchanged. No emotions, no personality, no influence, no charisma, no love, no hate, when there's no nonverbal cues. So the suggestion was, and many of the studies in the period, empirical studies, were finding this to be the case also. This bothered me at a theoretical level. It's not how I understood communication to work. It's not how I understood the interplay of language and physicality and audio and visual signals to work together. So it bothered me, but it not only bothered me theoretically, I started seeing examples all around me of where it didn't seem to be the case. In the first course I taught, where I invited the students to take part in a trial computer-mediated communication experiment, and you can see from the date, this was in 1988, quite a long time ago, this was the first note that a student posted. And I think you'll agree with, this is on the back of your program also, but I think you can hear somebody singing in this note. I think you can see in this note that there is playfulness there, and friendliness there, and jocularity there, and an invitation to get to know one another there. And there's no nonverbal cues, but all of those social and emotional elements are there. Now, I had another partner in crime. Sandra was working at a corporation in the time, and at this time, back in 88, 89, people thought when you get email, you print it out and then you read it. So Sandra was able to steal read email out of the waste baskets at the corporation where she worked, and this was one of the messages she stole from me. It's gossip, isn't it? It's gossip. Beth has not heard from Bob, and Bob told her he would get back to her by Tuesday. It's now Wednesday. Do you know anything? Beth just called me. And the exclamation points were there. This is before smiley dictionaries or anybody telling you to use all caps or exclamation points. People are natural with language. They're intuitive, they're expressive, and they're emotional. And of course, then the internet came along. This is all 88, 89 before we had the internet. Then the internet went public, and then everybody could see for themselves. Can you tell what this is? This is a response, isn't it? A response to what? It's a response to a marriage proposal online with ASCII art, and the answer, yes. And this was at a network. This is before dating sites. People met each other in hobby sites. They would get to know each other, find out what they had in common. So I thought there was a lot of emotion on the internet, and I thought people were pretty good at expressing it, but we didn't have theories to help us understand it at the time. So some of the theories that Cynthia attributed to me really were an act of good timing, if not good intelligence. But it was a good time to think about alternative approaches. And it's been my privilege to try to have some influence with theoretically based theories about the contingent effects of computer-mediated communication on social impressions and relationships. Contingencies depending on the influence of this, depending on that, depending on time frames, depending on different media characteristics like verbal cues, persistence of messages where you can still see them for a long time, the social goals people bring to interaction, the topics they discuss, the relationship of different sources to the reader, and the computational cues that emerge. And this is something, of course, very new. I'll give you an example of some of these factors and how they figured out into some of the research. Let's start with computational cues. This is very recent research, but this was something new. This was has to do with a study we did before Facebook really got rid of the wall. But you may remember Facebook used to have the wall. You would have your profile. People could leave messages on the wall. And you would describe yourself, and your friends would leave messages. There's a lot of attributes on this Facebook profile. One of the attributes, though, is how many friends you have. 76 in one network, 12 in 12. And Facebook used to tell you you have how many friends. And it indicated how many friends. There's 102 friends in this profile. We did an experiment. We wanted to see if these computational cues, just these cues, would influence people's impressions about the person. And you can see her face, you can see her self-disclosure. Is this little tiny computational cue going to be important? So we asked some subjects to see this version. We asked other student subjects to look at this version, where Chris Smith has 302 friends, or 502 friends, or 702 friends, or even 902 friends. We didn't know what the limit should be. And this was a risky, it's a simple study, but a risky study. The experimental stimulus was very, very small. Did it have an effect? It did have an effect. It changed people's perceptions of the social desirability, how much they would want to be friends with Chris Smith. Now, reviewers from the academic journals will be sent this. They said, well, what evidence do you have that people really were influenced by that friend count? We're pretty solid experimental researchers. We said that's the only possible factor that could have affected them. And we don't think they were aware of it at all. We had some evidence that suggests that was true. Well, this is a pretty simple study, but it shows us that popularity cues, very subtle cues, that the computers generate rather than the people, they have an influence on how attractive, good-looking, how much we want to be friends with somebody. I want to tell you about another study, a somewhat more complex study, where we looked at the contingent relationships of the factors of media characteristics in terms of using verbal rather than nonverbal behavior, and the social goals and topics that people discussed. This was a study that grew out of a long-term interest of mine of how the internet is changing our relationship to information that used to come via the mass media. I mean, we used to wait for the newspaper to come, or we'd tune into the 6 o'clock TV news, and we would get what came. Some people went to the library, people like us, but not a whole lot of people went to the library. But now, of course, things have changed. The information that is in the library or used to be in the mass media, it's persistent. It's there all the time. And I think it changes our relationship to the information. It's searchable to us, and we can use it opportunistically. But in addition to mass media being now persistent, our friends are also persistently available to us through a variety of mechanisms and all the time. And our mass media are available to us at the same time as our interpersonal conversations are available to us. What might this do? We had some ideas we wanted to test. That the interpersonal and relational goals that we bring to an interaction, they drive the content from the media that we search and that we use. That our relational goals drive the information that we seek, and we use that information in argumentation with other people. And that further, the argumentation that we make using the information affects our perceptions of what we think and what we see in others. It affects our attitudes. Well, I'm going to jump right to how we did this study, and I'm sorry there's so many steps, but it sets the scene for what we did. We had students come into the laboratory. We escorted them into separate rooms. Each room had a computer. We had each person individually rank and rate the best hamburgers in the area. We chose hamburgers because everybody has an opinion about it, but nobody cares that much. It's a malleable opinion, but one that everybody can tell you. So please rank and rate what's the best hamburger in the area. Choose among these 5. And then we swapped these pieces of paper that had both the names and the rankings. Then we went up to one of the 2 subjects in each combination. We said, we want you to be our confederate in this experiment. After a minute of the online chat you're going to have, we want you to act as though you really like this person, and you want this person to really like you. We're not going to tell you what to do to signal it. Just do as much as you can without making it obvious you were instructed. Do you have any questions? And they never did. Or we went to one person in each couple. We said, we want you to be our confederate. We want you to act like you dislike this person and you want them never to contact you again. Repel them. We'll not tell you how, but just do it the most you can without being obvious that we told you. And they said, okay. They didn't have questions for us. So we had an affinity goal or a disaffinity goal among one confederate in each pair. And we gave them 10 minutes to prepare for the conversation. We recorded what they did with their computers during that interval. Then they had a 10-minute real-time chat in which they typed to each other. Afterwards, we asked them to rate each other on certain social desirability scales and certain forms of attraction, including physical attraction. They'd never seen each other, so this was a risky measure. And then we asked them to rate their hamburgers again, and here's what we found with that information. The analysis asked the question, do subjects search for burger information in order to prepare for the discussion? And those with the disaffinity goals did. Those who had to go into the conversation and get the person not to like them, they didn't prepare themselves by trying to think how to be nasty. They looked up bad information about the other person's favorite hamburger. They steered the conversation into a topic, into arguments and disagreements, in order to have a negative relational effect. You know, in face-to-face communication, we don't necessarily do that. We want to show somebody we dislike them. If you don't want someone to persist in trying to date you or ask you out, you turn away, you lower your voice, you don't make mutual eye contact with them, and you don't have that online. You have to use what you have, and people are good at using what they have. In this case, they went to the topic to argue about the topic, and people looked up information in order to do that. We asked, did these confederates, did they use more arguments and agreements and disagreements about burgers to get people to like them or dislike them? And they did so very much, according to their own self-report. We found in the transcripts indication that they did as well. They did that more so than the people who didn't have a social goal. They argued, they agreed, they disagreed. Did the Confederates' expressions of agreement, disagreement, did affect their own burger attitudes? Yes, it did, in all cases and in all conditions. The more you said you liked this other person's burgers that they liked best, the more you liked it even better after the discussion was over. The more you said, your McDonald's, this is garbage, The less you liked McDonald's, your attitude changed during the process of the interaction. We didn't ask anybody to convince the other person their burger is no good. We just said have a discussion and so forth. They changed their own minds. They transformed their own attitudes, their own self-perceptions through the social circuitry of the interaction. And their change in their attitude correlated with the number of arguments that they made. Here was the unexpected findings that we got when we asked them, what do you think of the other person that you interacted with? The number of agreements that an individual made correlated with their ratings of the partner's social desirability and their partner's assessment of their partner's physical attractiveness. The more I said, yeah, Wendy's, it's best, the prettier you get. The more I say, yeah, those fries, too oily, the better looking and more friendly I think that you are. Positive arguments correlated with partners of the ratings of the partner's social desirability. Disagreements correlated negatively with ratings of the partner's social desirability. Through these arguments and through these relational interactions, people convince themselves this other person, not so good, not so desirable, uglier as they go along. I'll skip this slide and go to the next study, the last study I want to tell you about, probably the hardest study with the least control. But this one looked at time frames, which is an issue that's occupied a lot of my research attention. Media characteristics, social goals, and topic. This was a study we did on computer-mediated communication and the reduction of prejudice among Jews and Arabs in Israel. I was fortunate enough to have some collaborators in the Middle East who taught college courses in 3 different Israeli religious sectors, religious educational sectors. Now, previous research has examined whether computer-mediated communication is a really good environment for reducing prejudice. After all, you don't see that the other person dresses differently than you, looks differently than you, and maybe that's an opening. But previous research that used a single episode of real-time chat and asked people to focus on the Palestinian conflict, they found that CMC actually just made things worse. The language that the people used degraded into greater hostility over time, and more polarization comes out from a short-term chat focused on the conflict. We didn't do it that way. We did a long-term relationship over the course of an academic year in courses on teacher education, where the students had to work together on projects for which they were graded. They had to build collaboration, not talk politics. So we had students coming together from colleges in the Arab sector, the Orthodox Jewish colleges, the Jewish secular colleges. They worked in groups of 6 with 2 students from each of the sectors. We also had a control group. We had students at the same colleges who did not participate in these virtual groups for a year long. We pre-tested their attitudes in September of 2008, gave them the post-test in 2009, and then they had an after party in Tel Aviv where they met each other face to face. Here's our results on the graphs. And the colors show you where things are statistically different. But the pre-test attitude toward Arabs by religious Jews is a high level of prejudice. You can, the pre-test attitude toward Arabs by religious Jews shows a high level of prejudice. The Muslims show a much lower level of prejudice. The secular Jews were somewhere in the middle. But after this virtual groups experience of a year long working together by writing, we see that the religious Jews who participated in this project, their attitude toward Arabs is no different than that of secular Jews and no different than that of Muslims. And this is different at some level from the control group who did not participate. It worked somewhat to the same extent from the other perspective. In terms of attitude toward Jews, Muslims in the pretest have the least favorable attitude toward Jews. But those who participated in the year-long virtual groups did significantly change their attitude toward Jews. Those Muslims who did not participate in the groups did not change their attitude. This is something that we think was unlikely to have happened in face-to-face contact. But a long, cooperative, online exposure helps break things down, helps people get to know each other, know their particularities, become friends, colleagues, and develop some understanding of one another. So I said I was going to come out clean to you that I'm just a personal relationships researcher. What does this have to do with the technology debate? We talk about the technology debate, as Mark said earlier, the technology debate is showing up in the news all the time. It's in the news and it's in the national dialogue. I think the biggest news in the technology debate came out just last Friday in the indictment that the Mueller investigation handed down about the Russian interference in the American political process. And and it's all readable online, and it's fascinating reading. And I'd like to show you a little bit of it. It says that it asserts that as early as 2014, the defendants began operations to interfere with the U.S. political system. The defendants posing as U.S. persons and creating false U.S. persona operated social media pages and groups designed to attract U.S. audiences. These groups and pages, which address divisive political and social issues, falsely claimed to be controlled by U.S. activists. In fact, they were controlled by the defendants. And it has other information also. What I find fascinating about this is that, if true, the Russians seem to me to have appropriated the interpersonal communication and technology playbook. For instance, the Russians and whoever these culprits were, they surfaced divisive political issues, which we know from the Israeli research is going to lead to conflict and derision rather than cooperation. It's an easy trigger, and people are susceptible to it not only in the Middle East but in the U.S. as well. We know that they supported it with fake news websites, and we know from the research I described to you earlier, if news is available persistently, it's searchable, you can use it in arguments with people online, which will make people even uglier than they already are. We know that they had many bot-generated followers and friends on Facebook and on Twitter, and we know from the Facebook research with the popularity indicators that popularity makes you seem more desirable. And they did this over time. They lay low and let people think they were making friends, and that develops trust, and that develops good relationships online, and made them susceptible. So it's interesting to me. You can take the interpersonal lens, and it gives you a map into some of the problems in the political arena and the social arena very writ large. Imagine working with others, working with the psychologists and the sociologists and the computer scientists and the artists and the cultural studies people who bring their own lenses to this problem. And that's where we go, and that's what we learn, and that's how we do things at UCSB. The technology debate in the media and in society hit me nowhere harder than in this news story from last June, where a woman was convicted of contributing to the manslaughter of her boyfriend through the instant messaging text that they sent to each other over time. And one attorney interpreted the guilty verdict by saying, this is saying what she did is killing him, that the words literally killed him, that the murder weapon was her words. We've come a long way from the theoretical and empirical assumptions that text without nonverbal cues cannot convey emotion and cannot influence people. And we're just seeing how untrue that was and how we need to come to grips with it. The technology debate goes on. This morning we had the Sky News reporting that smartphones are a drug in our pocket. Last week we talked about early Facebook and Google employees forming a coalition to fight back what they built. I get up in the morning and I get email from Mark Bertelsen and Chuck House and Dave Toole, and they send me the news that Sandra hasn't yet sent me. And it's a good day for me, meeting CITS affiliates who have something to say or could have something to say about that. I'm having great days. Be careful what you wish for. I'm a big boy, and this is making me bigger. This is the technology debate. It's about technology and society research. It's not about simple answers. It's about multiple and contingent influences. It's about interdisciplinary approaches. It's about CITS. It's about UC Santa Barbara. Thank you very much.